Uh, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Could I urge you to take your seats speedily? And can I also, more importantly, welcome you to this event, Leading Powerhouses of the Future, the 5 Cities Mipim event. My name's Mike Emmerich. I'm the Chief Executive of New Economy in Manchester, and I'm going to facilitate this short session today. This group of cities, which today comprises Barcelona, Manchester, Amsterdam, Stockholm and Hamburg, have been working together one way or another at Mipim for the last 5 years or so. And in a partnership, an evolving partnership, changing partnership, that's been about how cities grow, how we learn from each other, how we hold ourselves up to scrutiny in order to learn from what other people have done, from what the market actors are telling us. And this is very deliberate in an attempt to hold ourselves up to scrutiny in order to become better cities, more prosperous and successful cities. 2 years ago, we've run this partnership with the OECD's LEAD program, and also latterly with some support from ULI, and we're delighted to have partnerships of that kind. And 2 years ago, we launched a report, New Growth and Investment Strategies by OECD, which looked at the kinds of practical investment actions cities need to take to be successful. We had a great debate on that. Last year, we went on from there, and we had Bruce Katz of the Brookings Institute, who talked to us about the Metropolitan Revolution, the book that he'd written, which shows how it's not about what core cities do, it's not about what places do on their own, it's about what places do together to create scale. And we thought this year the appropriate thing to do was to follow that up with a debate about leadership. Because if we've looked at the assets and how they're used, if we've looked at how places should work across boundaries to make more successful global cities, then the obvious next thing to us seemed to be to look at leadership. And I'm delighted to say that we've got a very distinguished group of people. We have representatives of our 5 cities, and we'll be hearing from Eric van der Burg, the Vice Mayor of Amsterdam, responsible for spatial planning, from Xavier Mayo from Barcelona, responsible for city promotion, Dr. Jürgen Bruns-Berentelg, the Chief Executive of Hafen City in Hamburg, Sahar Bernstein, the Chief Executive of Manchester, and Olli Zetterberg, who's the Chief Executive of Stockholm Business Region. We'll be hearing their reactions in a minute, but the focus of today's event is very much on our keynote speaker, who is Greg Clark. He'll speak in a few minutes, and then what we'll hear to kick us off after Greg is from a panel of, I would say, distinguished women, but not quite. Because there's one interloper among them. But I'm pleased that we've got a near-all-women expert panel for our cities that comprises Anne Kavanagh, the Chief Executive of AXA Real Estate, Lisette Van Doorn, the newly appointed Chief Exec of ULI Europe, Rosemary Feenan, the Director of Global Research for JLL, Deborah Mountford from the OECD, who's a Senior Policy Analyst there, and Chris Darroch of Hermes. But as I said, the main focus of today is a speech by Greg Clark. Some of you will know from the GLE Enterprises, perhaps from Communities and Local Government in the UK or the LDA. Most of you will know him as one of the leading cities experts, authors of the new book on London, coming out tomorrow. Also as the author of a book on world cities. But most importantly in this context, he's chair of one of the OECD's lead forums and the senior fellow at ULI Europe. But even before I introduce Greg, I want to introduce somebody else just to say a few words to us. Because we've been running this partnership for a few years now, and we've always worked with Reed Meadem on it. But it was having seen last year and the success of last year's event that we had much more intensive conversations with Reed Meadem and agreed that the right thing to do was to bring this event into the Palais, which is why we're sitting in this splendid auditorium today. So perhaps just really to say a few words of welcome on behalf of Reed Meadem, can I ask you to welcome Jean-Marc André, who is the Conference Director for Mipim. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear panelists. Welcome. We have the unique opportunity for 1 hour and a half to be citizens of 5 wonderful cities. So I'd like to welcome you. Bienvenue à Cannes. Welcome in Amsterdam. Benvinguts, Barcelona. Willkommen in Hamburg. Welcome in Manchester. And welcome in Stockholm. I'd like to thank these 5 cities for thinking out of the box and partnering in creating this unique forum. For 26 years now, Mipim, whether here in Cannes, in Hong Kong, in London, and soon in Tokyo, is the place where cities and governments and investors imagine and build the conditions for urban sustainable growth. So we've seen over the years in all these geographies that cities have really indeed become the leading powerhouses, defining the future. So no point that the theme for this first year was obvious to us when you proposed it to us, and thank you for doing this. I won't talk for all these brilliant panelists and dear Greg, but I would just add, what do we expect from a leader? Maybe I think we expect from a leader that he creates the context for all the contributors and followers to develop urban projects together. So I would say there's no good leader without good followers, and that was true even before Twitter was invented. So this said, thank you for having proposed us to partner with you, because I think you're really creating the context and in this way act as real leaders and leading cities and powerhouses. Thank you for creating the context with this forum to exchange with the audience and you all there in the context of Mipim. So I wish the best success as possible to the Mipim City Investment Forum and a long life to it. Welcome, and I leave the talk now to Greg Clark. Thank you again.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here with us today. What we're going to try to do in the next hour and a bit, beginning with 20 minutes from me, is to investigate and reveal what I would call the links between city leadership, future growth, and investment. And the OECD LEAD program is taking forward this study that you heard Mike talk about, looking at local leadership in 5 successful cities. Collaborative leadership for inclusive growth is what we're calling it. What is the role of leadership? How do we measure leadership? How do we measure the leadership premium that comes from cities? And in these remarks, I'll be drawing upon work that's done by the OECD, by the Urban Land Institute, the World Bank, academic literature, and case studies and market perceptions. And you'll see that we have a timetable. We're launching this investigation today, and eventually the OECD will be publishing this report at their forum in Manchester in June. Now, all this talk of city leadership invites us to make the metaphor or the connection that cities are somehow like businesses. And if you like that comparison, then what you tend to say is that, yes, cities are becoming more like businesses. They compete in contested markets. They have to innovate in the way they use finance. They have clearly defined goals. They have to network. They're interested in R&D. They have human capital strategies. They have to worry about their brand. They have to build a strong leadership proposition. And that leads to conversations about cities needing their own CEOs and cities needing a strong board of directors and a clear business strategy and everything else. So in a certain way, yes, cities are becoming like businesses. The more globalization is the context in which that occurs. But there's also a sense in which cities are not at all like businesses. Risk-taking in cities is controlled. There's often a poor fit between what we might call the institutional geography and the market geography. Cities have very complex governance arrangements. Lots of different people are in charge of different strands. Cities can't choose their customers, they can't choose their products, they can't choose the markets they operate in. And the profit that they make, when they do make a profit, is often taken by another tier of government so that they can't use it. And so there are all sorts of ways, including how city leaders are selected, how the identity and the brand of the city is shaped by nations and by others, that point to the fact that cities are, in a sense, really not like businesses as well. So this leads to a kind of summary that starts our conversation. We could say that cities suffer from some wicked problems and challenges that businesses don't always have. Cities sometimes suffer from short-termism and from political fragmentation. They sometimes have multiple jurisdictions and institutions, so you don't really know who's in charge. They often have limited access to capital and therefore a low investment rate. Their power is subordinated to higher tiers of government, and their reputation, their brand, and their identity is often controlled or influenced by people from outside them. So this could be a kind of suicide pact for city leaders, couldn't it, if you think about these problems? But in fact, it's these exact challenges that create the framework in which city leadership is able to do its job, is able to weave its magic, is able to overcome these kinds of limitations and constraints in order for the city to prosper and succeed. A good example of this, I think, is in the area of local economies. Most city governments are not designed with the idea of building the local economy in mind. They're there to provide services, to regulate land uses, to represent the people. And yet, all city leaders feel the need to develop their economies, to create jobs, to attract investment, to build opportunity. And therefore, they have to tackle a very particular set of challenges to do with geographies and time frames, the mismatch of tools, the lack of investment capacity, the approach to risk. All of these things require city leaders to invent a new set of tools, a new set of institutions, a new set of approaches that enable city leaders to create a dividend and to overcome what is otherwise a deficit. Now, in Europe, this has become very much more important, particularly for the competitive, middleweight powerhouses of the future cities, that as Europe has integrated, cities have been unlocked from their national urban hierarchies and instead have an opportunity to compete, to play, to differentiate themselves on a new European map of cities that allows them to play to their strengths rather than to be considered as second division or third division cities. This corresponds with a big shift in how we think about cities. Whereas we used to think of them as problems, we now think of them as a means to development and assets. Whereas we used to think that the city was something that required hardware, we now think of cities as needing software. Whereas we used to think about cities just competing with each other, we now think about a system of cities, a European system of cities, a global system of cities in which all of this can work. So, as we think about how city leaders play their role, they play them across this changing canvas. And they also, as we find with these leading powerhouses, they shift through multiple cycles of urban development, where in the first cycle the projects are mainly physical. In the second cycle we move towards strategies for the longer term and we build brands and propositions, particularly visitor brands. In the third and the fourth cycle, the relationship between the public leaders and the private leaders becomes more mature, but it also becomes more sophisticated. The relationships with other institutions, with national governments, become more complex. The leadership dividend increases as the city becomes more mature and moves itself through several cycles of development. And by the time you become a global powerhouse, like one of the cities here today, the complexity of leadership relationships and how they work is a very important and sophisticated part of the hardware and the software for the future. Now, the Brookings Institution started to observe how these competitive powerhouse cities were beginning to compete in new ways with what we might call the established megacities. What they observed is that whereas in the past, in the previous 30 years, we thought that you had to be a port city or a capital city, you had to be a financial services hub or a corporate HQ in order to be a world city. These days, the ingredients of being a successful world city have changed. Now you can be a successful world city by offering a particular kind of culture or lifestyle, by being a leader in science or technology or medicine, by leading in the creative industries, in the arts, in the information sector, in media, in decision-making, in higher education. In other words, in this new cycle of globalization, a new set of industries is globalizing, and this provides the opportunity for new powerhouse cities to emerge with specializations in those kinds of sectors. And so we see many other ambitious secondary cities and others becoming world cities, becoming global leaders in their own right. Brookings' observation was that we might see 10 traits in any city that's able to do this, and not all cities are able to do it. Trait number 1, leadership with a worldview. The competitive mindset that sees the city in the total context of global dynamics and global opportunities. Trait number 2, enabling governance, institutional frameworks that work for the city, that overcome those weaknesses. And this chimes particularly well with what OECD LEAD has already observed about the new growth path that's being adopted by these competitive middleweight cities, where a more diversified and private sector-led development process is in train, where support for SMEs and entrepreneurs and building an enterprise economy is right at the heart of what's happening, where consolidation of future employment sectors is being undertaken carefully and in a considered way, where the links with emerging markets, with the growth, the global growth map, are being optimized, and the patterns of trade and foreign direct investment and capital inflow are being changed, and where cities are intent on competing for investment in infrastructure, real estate, technology, and others. And all of this leads to a kind of new leadership toolbox around investment, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. Now, ULI's work in this area about how cities become business-friendly and investment-ready also picks up this theme of leadership extremely well, and says that cities are looking to enhance their business friendliness and their investment readiness for a whole series of reasons, but mostly because there's a demanding new customer base of investors and corporate locators who want a customized relationship with a city, not just a relationship with a macroeconomic framework. And so the local tier of business friendliness and investment readiness has become critical. So when we think about what business friendliness is at a city, it's about city managers and leaders deliberately improving upon national framework conditions through a customized approach to investors and businesses. And when we think about what investment readiness is, it's about the ability of a city to prime itself to the particular demands of new investors and to bring forward a pipeline of investment-ready projects. The ability of a city to align itself with the needs of investors. This is very important for cities at the moment because since the global financial crisis, the available system of financing for cities has completely changed. You don't need to read my slide to see that on the right-hand side, the new sources of investment capital are user charges, value capture finance, the international financial institutions, the sovereign wealth funds, private equity, all of those things that have a very different set of requirements for how a city responds to their needs. Lastly, let's observe that this places a strong accent on the ability of cities to build a compelling identity and reputation in a global system. One where, for example, the business and investor brand of the city is not obscured by the visitor brand. It's very easy, if you're a middle-sized city, to become an attractive place to play. It's very important for business leaders and city leaders working with them to create a strong business and investor brand that says this is a place to invest as well. So one of the places that these cities get help from is from a new generation of business leadership organizations. These are multi-sector groups that have a far-sighted approach, that are willing to work in partnership with city governments to prioritize a set of long-term projects. in other cities of similar sizes like Auckland, like Toronto, and of course in Barcelona that we have here with us, you see these kinds of organizations emerging as partners for cities. And there are many, many more of them. So leadership in that complex third or fourth cycle is a shared task. We can evaluate how these business leadership organizations contribute to the leadership of cities. And it started already here with this analysis. Let's now look at our 5 powerhouses, if we may. Amsterdam, Barcelona, Hamburg, Manchester, Stockholm, all cities that have begun to distinguish and differentiate themselves very decisively, not just in that new European system of cities, but also on a global stage. We think about the leadership agendas that have been pursued here. Think of Amsterdam first, and of course the Deputy Mayor will talk about this later, but this is a resurgent city that has become not just a global leader again, as it always was, but a leading entity in an integrating region in that part of the Netherlands. Leadership has been organic, but it has been very purposeful. The key drivers, of course, have been the cultural and economic success of Amsterdam as a location, which has enabled many other municipalities to wish to affiliate with it. So the Amsterdam metropolitan area has become an organizing tool for many that wouldn't otherwise be there. Mayor van der Laan, the colleague, of course, of the Deputy Mayor who's here, has particularly fostered cultural collaboration with other cities and with institutions, and university leaders and other business leaders have been a very key part of that. Amsterdam has also created new institutions. There are many of them, but one of them is the Amsterdam Economic Development Board, where public and private sector are starting to work together on a global strategy around growth sectors for Amsterdam. Annual funding is in place to enable the organization to succeed, and there's a strong focus here on the global economy and branding. Barcelona is our next city. I'm just nodding at my colleague, Mike. I think I'm on 14 minutes, Mike. Barcelona is a mature leadership system in, of course, a city that's become very much a Mediterranean hub. The city of Barcelona, working together with many partners, including the Chamber of Commerce, brought forward after the crisis a new Barcelona growth agenda. And this was a determined focus that within the face of austerity to bring forward something that would be pro-growth, that would tackle unemployment, would bridge the gap between education and professional employment, a much more diversified brand, and would attract investment into technology and logistics sectors. One key part of this has been a new pact or deal in Barcelona to create transparency and responsibility between finances and policies, ensuring that political leaders, as it were, stick to a continuous program of investment in reforms, which they want to do, and making the work that they do transparent in that regard. So, because of this, Barcelona has become once again the leading growth center, of course, in the Mediterranean area. If we look at Hamburg for a few minutes, we can see a city here that has pursued a strategy coming out of recession, which is essentially a strategy of inclusive growth for the future, where the alternative to austerity has been pursued by continuously investing long-term, but tackling short-term problems at the same time. Mayor Olaf Scholz, who many of you know, has been a new leader with a new approach here, bringing in other players, building alliances, and also building multi-party support. He promised to balance the budget by 2014, which has been done, but in order to do that, he restrained long-term growth and focused instead on immediate priorities. And one of these in particular has been housing. And for those of you who are seeking solutions to the affordable housing problem, the Hamburg approach has been really innovative in this regard. There's also been a very strong focus on sector-based leadership. Manchester is perhaps the primary city that has learned how to use leadership to earn the power to propel its city forward. And Manchester's substantial negotiations with the British government over the last 2 years have yielded incredible results in terms of the devolution of central government power to the city. Manchester needed to do this because its economy has been monocentric, but it's been a city that's been underbounded. In other words, the jurisdiction of the city of Manchester has been too small for the economy that is there. And by undertaking and leading these reforms, which have been led by Sir Howard Bernstein, who you'll hear from shortly, and Sir Richard Leese, in conjunction with other metropolitan leaders, Manchester has been able to build a platform for success that was otherwise denied it because of an institutional framework that didn't work. And in that regard, leaders from other parts of the metropolitan area have been really key. So what Manchester has done, as I said, is to learn how to earn the right to propel its city through careful negotiation, coupled with private sector leadership, which has been very effective, supported by business-led and independent evidence-building and case-making, and building relationships with central government that have incrementally provided more resources for the city so that it can win the means to develop the city directly. And again, we'll hear more about this shortly. Stockholm's leadership approach has been very much to position it anew with a new story about its role in the global economy. The self-styled capital of Scandinavia, the leadership task has been to build a coalition around this proposition, reorganizing around a common message, with the Stockholm Business Alliance providing the leadership for the 53 municipalities to work together. Key roles being played here by the ex-mayor Annika Billström. And there's been the tacit support of business to make this work. One area where Stockholm has particularly excelled is in creating leadership around its innovation system and building the ecosystem for new businesses to grow, for new sectors to trade, for the capitalization of its own innovation so that it can be a global innovation leader for the future. Now, this quick run-through of our 5 cities doesn't do justice to any of them, and I apologize to all of the people on my left-hand side for sprinting through that content. But what I want to say is that the relationship between leadership, reform, and success seems to be a very clear relationship. So what can we observe immediately before we've even completed this study? Firstly, the city leaders appear to do 5 things very well. They create ambition and they create a new mindset, a renewal of the sense of purpose of the city. Secondly, they build vision and strategy that can be utilized by many. These are inclusive visions that provide coordination and orientation to a new global dynamic. Thirdly, partnership is to the fore, new alliances and new tools. Fourthly, they are business and investor-facing, customizing, inviting businesses and investors to work with them. And then fifthly, they are able to identify and leverage catalysts really successfully, whether those catalysts be major sports events or major pieces of infrastructure or the merger of universities. What are the results so far? What we can observe is that these cities are able to take a longer-term approach and achieve through-cycle continuity that is otherwise absent. They create new investment opportunities and they increase the investment rate. They opt for distinct specializations within a productive city that enables them to compete globally despite being middleweight in their size. And they provide, therefore, a very important investment option beyond the mega cities. Lastly, we might say that all of these cities have become leaders within their regions, cities that are able to set the agenda for others, and others have begun to follow. They're resilient and competitive cities where leadership seems to have been the ingredient that's made them more investable. Thank you very much.
Well done, Greg. Thanks, Greg. That was a veritable tour de force around some very complex issues, but presented admirably clearly. On my right is a panel of people who are all very serious people in their own rights, and what they say about cities matters. So let's hear from them about what they've heard. Rosemary Feenan of JLL, you advise lots of investors about what to look at. How have the things that that you're suggesting people look at. How's that changed, and what role does leadership play in what you're telling investors, particularly in the light of what Greg's just said?
Yeah, absolutely. Leadership is certainly very important. But here's my question, which is that in the real estate world, of course, where does it hit the ground when it comes to investment? We currently have, what, $15 maybe chasing every $1 of asset. So how do we create the asset so quickly? What does leadership need to do to actually make that happen? And how do we really pour into the market the partnership that creates the jobs, the futures, and really contends with a whole load of global ambition cities outside Europe that can do it quicker, with very different governance models, which may not always be as democratic as ours, and that definitely are out for that level of skill that they can attract quite effectively. And therefore, from a real estate perspective, the simple fact is 30 cities absolutely still attract, and have done for over a decade, 50% of all real estate investment. How is that going to change? Where does leadership actually make sure that investors understand the capability?
Absolutely crystal clear, and that's something I'm sure the cities are going to want to return to in a moment. Chris Darroch of Hermes, you've invested in a lot of cities that are restructuring their land uses, creating new assets. You know, who's succeeding, and what part is leadership playing in that success, do you think?
Well, from our perspective, leadership is essential when we're investing in any city, and I think it's important when you consider where we are now. You've got to look back a wee bit in history, what happened to cities in the past. You know, post-war, speaking from a UK perspective, the provincial cities in the UK were the powerhouses of the economy. In the late 60s, Birmingham, for example, had a higher average wage than London in the southeast. So these were places that people wanted to live and work. Planning policy and government intervention to control the development of industrial and office premises effectively curtailed the growth in the cities because they were concerned about how strong they were becoming. And really that's coincided with a planning policy that supported moving people out of the city and making them more car-centric, really kind of ripped the heart out of the city. And I guess you can see that as a time when there was no local accountability. So the power had moved, shifted more to Westminster, and there was no real kind of leadership in the city centres. We're now seeing a situation where cities are becoming more important. People want to migrate back into them. They want to live there, they want to work there, they want to play there. It's happened in London, and the trend is happening in other UK cities, and we're buying into that story. And we're only managing to do that where we have a collaborative approach with the local authority, with the council, with the leaders. We're very involved with Manchester, Noma just now, with Sir Howard, and without his assistance, it simply wouldn't work. He manages to knock heads together and make things happen, and that's what you need. That's what a leader is all about, in my view. So together with the council, we look at this Noma as an example, and the other schemes we're involved in is recreating that fabric of the city centre, which was lost through mismanagement in the past, and it can only work where there's a combined approach from private and public sector.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Chris. Deborah from OECD, the OECD in the LEAD programme, you look at a lot of cities and a lot of different strategies. What do you reckon the key ingredients are from what you've seen for cities to be investment ready? And again, where does leadership fit in that piece for you?
I think what we've seen, and it's important to remember that our mandate at the OECD is to national governments. It's to advise them. It is to help them shape better policies and to draw on an evidence base. What we've seen through this relationship with these cities is a unique opportunity to influence the 32 countries that sit round our table, that take part in looking at their own policies in light of what these cities are doing. And leadership has really come out to them as something, and we have had requests from a diverse range of our member countries that really want to understand more about what is it that these cities are doing? Why is it that leadership matters so much? And it is these long-term factors that Greg talked about. It is the collaborative approach. And many cities now, but also national governments, as they're rebalancing economies, emerging from the crisis, focusing on jobs, focusing on people. It is how these cities have led those processes. The reason that we have these 5 cities on the platform today is because they have 20, 30 years of resilient collaborative leadership to build on, to take them forward. And I think from our perspective, being able to influence national policy, broaden it out to developing economies and to emerging markets so that they are looking at global best practice to help shape how the cities of tomorrow can learn from these cities to really get the basics right.
Great stuff. Thank you, Deborah. So I think Rosemary started with how do we create the investable assets that the market can really respond to, and is that 30 cities, 50% of the market going to shift? Chris, it's about comeback cities, you know, buying into renewal, getting the collaborative approaches, and Deborah's very much on how we get cities through strong leadership influencing national policies. But Lizette, turning to you, I guess partly with your ULI experience, but probably with rather more of what preceded it, given that you've only been in post 2 months. One of the things that Greg talked about a lot was cycles of investment and how cities change and cycles of city development, which kind of begs the question, particularly when the investor market's changing and the people who are actually active are changing. Are we seeing differences in the investment market? Do cities need to understand the differences between what private equity, sovereign wealth funds and others are looking for? What's your take on that, and particularly in relation to this core question of what cities need to do to lead their way out of the issues?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question, because you see 2 angles. We see the investment market changing rapidly. We see many new players coming onto the European market, for example, Asian investors. You already mentioned private equity. We have several wealth funds, and they all have different needs in terms of product they're looking for, sectors they're looking for, but maybe even more importantly, the type of risk and return they're looking for, the investment horizon they have. And I think if a city would understand that properly, it would help in offering the right product to the right type of investor. And also being able maybe to build long-term relationships, which do not mean long-term, or that they all have to invest for the long term in one asset, but you can build a long-term relationship that cities want to come back and do more. And I think what's also very interesting in the investment market at the moment is that I think we're seeing more and more vertical integration in the whole properties column, that we see many more investors / fund managers. I think Anne is the right person to say even more about that, who not only invest but also develop. So they're willing to take on the development risk and stay on for the long term. And I think that underpins a very important general trend across the market, which goes far beyond investment. And that's the eye that investors have for not just the asset, but much broader than that. It's the place they invest in, which is not just the risk return of a building. That's about the livability. It's about sustainability. It's about accessibility. And I think that is the link to leadership, because that requires leadership to get there. And then investors are willing to invest and stay in for the long term.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. I remember when I was a student, one of the books I read had the title, "You Can't Drain the Ocean with a Teaspoon," which was a reference to local economic developments in some areas of the north of England during the early 1980s. And that kind of begs a question in a modern context, and perhaps more positively. You know, really, in the face of these huge global pressures of sovereign wealth funds who can and do choose exactly where they want to go, can cities really make a material difference? I wonder if perhaps to finish off this section, Anne, you could give us a perspective from what you've seen at Tax Investments.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm pleased to say is, and I checked before coming here today, is that we're invested in all 5 of these cities.
Coincidence not.
And, you know, what makes one city a better investment partner than another? It's no different to any partner for business. You know, what are we looking for the partners we work with? I think the first one is trust. Second is alignment of interests, whether it's short or long term. It's honesty, it's transparency, and it's being open for a dialogue. You know, it's very hard to be in any partnership if it's not open for a dialogue. So I think the partnership is no different to what we seek in our investment partners, our operating partners. It's the same principles. And I think in terms of, you know, how can a city make a difference to our investing decisions, you know, it's then about all the things we've been discussing. It's about the growth prospects, it's about the economy, attracting occupiers, it's the demographics, the demand and the supply, it's the normal investment decisions, infrastructure, and last but not least, dynamic leadership. I mean, we've talked about that, but it's really key. And all of those factors go into our debates at Investment Committee about where we invest, how much we invest, and whether they're short or long-term decisions.
Great stuff. So again, I think there's plenty of confirmation of where we started this conversation with what Rosemary was saying, but also something that very much echoes what Lisette was saying too. Before we go to the cities, can I ask you, clearly in any leadership environment, you've got a balance between structures and different kinds of organising cities, and you've got the people who actually do it. Would any of you like to just give a view on where the balance lies for you? Is it all about the people, or is it about the structures as well? Who wants to give us a view on that?
I think it's both, because if I'm talking from the investment perspective again, investors are in for the long term generally, and sometimes that goes beyond people, especially in a city environment. So I think it's both. And I think it reflects, it goes back to the points that Anne was also making, transparency. I think it's policy. And that structure has to be right. Yeah. And then people have influence in that, but it's definitely the combination.
Okay.
Yeah, I think also it's never just one person, because you want the strength and the depth. If it's just one person, it's not deep enough.
Absolutely. I think you also find from the OECD work, you find that places tend to generate certain kinds of leaders. Places have their own DNA, and some places tend to get this better than other places. Is that?
That is right, but certainly also what we're seeing is it tends to be groups of leaders, but I think where the people dimension really does come into mattering is where a place has to go through a seismic change, where shocks have occurred, whether they be economic or whether they be some disaster consequence. Having someone or a small group of people to be able to lead that forward really is quite remarkable. Yeah, and I think we can often see that in some cities that have gone through quite radical change that we can now look back on 20, 30 years later, and we really can pinpoint a lot of success down to quite a narrow group of individuals and how they could bring all other actors within the city along with them.
Great stuff. Okay, I'm going to draw that to a close and perhaps turn to this side, excuse me, turn this way, to talk to our city. So what we've had a really insightful presentation from Greg and some really good comments from our advisors and investors. The challenge to all of you really is to say, well, what does that mean for you? What have you heard so far that makes you think about what it is that your investment plans are going to be the future? What changes might you think about? And perhaps on that last thing I was on then, you know, what implications does this have for leadership within the city? So perhaps we might go in order, starting with Eric van der Berg, the Vice Mayor of Amsterdam. Eric.
I agree that leadership is not about one person, but it can be about one function. The mayor of a city is very important, and I think that when I ask the people here who is more important for the public opinion, the Prime Minister of the UK or the Mayor of London, some of them would say the Mayor of London. So a mayor can be very important as a leader, and that's the first issue. The second one is leadership is also about helping. A leading city has to help the region and has to help other cities. Yeah. Not only other cities like here, but the cities who won't do it as well as the cities that are sitting here. That's important for leadership. And the most important words that Greg was talking about for me is customized partnership. I think that is very important. Not only partnership, but you have to make it customized. So I think that are the main issues in the presentation and in the
Great stuff. That's very, very clear. That sort of a sort of governance take on the flexible specialisation, which I think Greg really talked a great deal about. Can I now go to Barcelona and to Xavier Mayo? What are your observations on what you've heard?
Well, some of the things that have been tackled already. I would say the first thing that not to forgive the basics. Cities are places where people live, people want to obtain jobs, has been tackled by Deborah. I mean, these are the basic issues. One of the successes maybe of Barcelona that wants to live is that people have the perception that you live well in one city, that can be shared on many of the cities present here. So don't forgive the basics, the structure of the city. The second, the structure are not just services, keeping the streets clean, jobs. The structure is aware the consensus in which the city is managed and is led. And this consensus mean that leaders have to be collaborative, not just one person, as you were saying, that it has been shared. In the case of Barcelona, Greg was explaining about Barcelona Global. There are emergent leaderships that have to be counted with them. And the second and the third thing would be, in my opinion, that leaders have been city leaders for leading cities. I mean, these cities have to need to have the power to light other cities in certain issues. Very recently, we have been named a lighthouse city in the smart city question, a European Commission project, in order to have follower cities, in order to help them to become more smarter from the environmental point of view as well. So collaborative, it will be the third question.
Great stuff. I think that's absolutely clear. I think one thing that's really resonating for me so far in this conversation is that partnership, collaboration, flexibly looking across boundaries is a big part of the story, and perhaps vindication of why we're all sat or indeed stood here today. Jürgen, perhaps could you give us your views on Hamburg and how this looks from where you're sat?
Well, I'd like to expand on one point, I think, which is the first question, which was raised, how investors can actually be integrated into an urban development process. And I'm looking into investment in two types of categories. So to say, standing investments which are already existing in the city, there are completely different preconditions than actually development conditions for investors. And that requires basically a lot of thrust into a long-term strategy of the city. Because when you have long-term investments, which are basically development investment, that requires a lot of risk-taking from the investment side, and it requires a lot of potential understanding of what actually leadership in the city wants to achieve. And on the other hand, it requires a trust that this leadership aspect, the aspirations, will not change in 2 or 3 or 4 years, but that there is a long-term strategy. So what we did probably in Hamburg was to create a coalition of housing. And that was not only an administrative tool, but that included a lot of local and regional and national housing companies and trade organizations, bringing them together into a strategy which basically tripled the supply of housing within 4 years. So that can be achieved by collaborative leadership at the public level, integrating also very much the level of investors. And that naturally has ramifications, positive one, also on commercial investments, for example, where big institutional investors come with urban development proposals covering $1 billion investment in other locations, because this acts also as a signifier of good city management. And I think leadership and good long-term city management go together. That would be my view from Hamburg.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Again, very, very clear. I'll summarize on that in a moment. Howard, a Mancunian perspective?
I would categorize leadership, certainly in today's terms, as coming under 3 broad headings. First, I would talk about place. I think all of us have learned over the years that If you just see yourself as the leader of an organization, you actually miss the bigger picture. So the leadership of place and how you discharge that collaboratively, in partnership, all the rest of it, with business and others is fundamental, because until you can do that, you are not going to be able to create the places that people want to invest and people want to live. So I think that's point number one. I think the other important aspect, certainly from a city like Manchester, is how you grow demand. And that involves quite a sophisticated balance between specialisation and diversification. For those of us, the slide which showed Manchester, one of the global powerhouses, a couple of 100 years ago, we didn't get the diversification side of that particularly well. We have worked very, very hard to diversify and deepen our business base. But if you are going to secure global distinction, if you're going to be able to secure the maximum access to international capital, then you've got to have some standardization or specialization as well. And that is around technology, certainly advanced materials, life sciences, which are peculiar Manchester strengths. I think the third and final aspect for me around leadership in a Manchester context is your business model. The services that are relevant in a place like Manchester, and I would suggest other areas in Europe today, are not necessarily the ones that we would have prioritised 10 or other years ago. So how we tackle all those aspects of public service which are fundamental to driving the productivity of our labour market, worklessness, health, social care, are increasingly important, I believe, in the modern economy.
Great stuff. And finally, can I ask Ollie Zetterberg from Stockholm to give your perspective?
Yeah, just a few remarks on. First of all, thank you, Greg, for a splendid explanation of all the things that we know now better since you've been telling us. Just a few remarks on the question of leadership and political leadership. I think that in the case of Stockholm, it was obvious after 10 years ago, there was an OECD report on the Stockholm region telling that the problems that we have in the region was that we didn't have any institutional, regional decision-making entities or organizations. And the answer to that was that we are still, 10 years later, we don't have any. And we instead focused on a partnership in between all those 50 municipalities and cities throughout the greater region of Stockholm that was pointed out in Greg's presentation. And I think this has been quite, or extremely, I would say, value for the region of Stockholm, because then this is a voluntary cooperation, and when people and the cities are rallied to Stockholm to know that there are no other people to collaborate with, because we are located almost at the North Pole, as everybody knows. So we just can't cooperate with each other. So there's no others. And all those political leaders in the smaller municipalities, they got to know that. And then, of course, in the City Hall of Stockholm, the lead was taken by the woman who was mentioned here, Annika Billström. And when there was a shift of rules, so the blue team entered the podium. They took over the same questions and they're doing the same policy. Now we're back to the red team again in the City Hall. So, and they are totally agreed on this policy. So I think this has been extremely important for the region of Stockholm, this voluntary cooperation. And there is a lot of efforts done by politicians to make those new regional parliaments or whatever. And I think that politicians tend to talk very much about who's going to be on top on each other, who's going to sit on which chair and so forth. It's much more valuable if you work very hard to strengthen your own operations, you make your community best business friendly, and you try to market the region together. I think that is much more productive than discussing new regional parliaments or whatever. Of course, there need to be somewhere, but I think cooperation in between political leaders is the key to success.
Thank you. And I think that was more centred on leadership, which I think is particularly important in the context of this session. So what I've heard is that it's about cities to respond to the kinds of agendas that Greg was talking about, creating assets, assets at scale, which very often mean working across boundaries. But I thought Rosemary put up a really good question, which is, if 30 cities, 30 places have been responsible for 50% of the investment and that hasn't changed very much, the question we've got to come back to is, what role would listening to the kind of stuff that Greg has been talking about, what role could that play in enabling cities like these 5 to change that, to get more of that investment and to change those numbers? I mean, that's the key question I think you were asking, isn't it? Rosemary. Who wants to, what are the cities? Is that doable, do you think? Howard, you're nodding.
I think it's eminently doable. And I think one of the surprising things for me, frankly, is to see how well some of us have done, comparatively speaking, having regard to the fact that we've got 2 hands tied behind our back. I think one of the true tests will be that once you start to address some of the key constraints on city growth, how much that can actually transform economic outcomes. If you look at R&D investment as one example, clearly an important part of any powerhouse, whether we're talking north or any type of economic development. But what we see too much of still, in my view, is an over-concentration of research and development investment in certain parts of a country. If we are going to grow cities, then that has to be at the highest levels of government, an absolute commitment to actually rebalance some of that out, because you can go around all parts of the world. If you see a world-class city, you will also see a world-class university at its heart. And what we have to do is to create those engines of research and innovation in many parts, not just of the UK, but in Europe as well.
Great stuff. Any of the other cities?
Maybe another thing would be opening the structures, opening the governments, opening the information, giving more detailed data about projects, programs like you are having in Hamburg, letting investors have very clearly which is the time set, which are the conditions. This is something that I think we have a lot to improve, at least in Barcelona.
Great stuff. Okay, I'm going to ask Greg to come back in a minute on this question that Howard's just put on the table about what your research is telling you about how diversification of investment strategies, research and development, universities, culture, what role that's playing and what lessons for leadership seem to come out from there. But Rosemary, since you asked the question at the outset about 30 cities and 50%, do you find what you're hearing plausible? Are we going to see the shift in those numbers?
Yeah, I do think we will, and we're seeing signals of change already. And in fact, there's about 20 cities that pop in and out to the bottom end of those 30, and they are, with a very few exceptions, what we would call tech cities. The cities that have really understood this new technical commercial geography. Everyone wants a Silicon geography, sort of Silicon Wadi in Tel Aviv and Silicon Lagoon in Lagos, and obviously our roundabout in London and Silicon Valley in Santiago. Everybody is really picking up on this. And I think a key point for jobs in the future, there's a research out now that says 50% of our existing jobs will be automated within the next 10 or 15 years. It's the cities that are really grabbing forward this future for these young, skilled people that is going to change that list, in my view. And Greg's absolutely right. You don't have to be a big megacity to be a world city.
Greg?
Well, I think the point that's been made that I would characterize as the urbanization of capital is a very important point. But I suspect that the question is not how do you get into the 30 in Rosemary's list, but how does the 30 become 50?
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's going to happen in this cycle that we're now embarking in at the moment. Howard's point, I think, is absolutely right. That if you like, I said, in order to be a global city in the past, you had to be a kind of institutional city. You had to be a headquarters, you had to be a financial center, a capital city, a port. That's gone. I think now you have to be a productive city to be a world city today. And that means you have to be up in the value chain that Howard was talking about in relation to science, technology, medicine, higher education, R&D more broadly, intellectual property for sure. And in that value chain, the accumulation of those productive assets that Howard mentioned is the thing that then leads to population growth, it leads to student population, it leads to expansion of the city, and that combined with these metropolitan and city regional approaches people have been talking about creates the combination that I think the investors want, which is a productive economy with a large enough asset base to make the scale of investment possible. Great. So that is why I think we'll end up with 50 cities in Rosemary's map.
I think that one of the most important things to produce is knowledge.
Yeah.
Name one major city without a university, and that isn't the capital. So you have to produce knowledge. Yeah. Cities are the place where not only people meet, but also where intellect meet and where solutions can meet. And that can make the difference. So I think invest in universities, invest in knowledge, is investing in cities.
Great. That must be right, Jürgen.
I would like to raise another point because I think it gets a little bit lost. When we are talking about the investment flows and the capital flows internationally, we are looking very much into mobilized or mobile capital to a certain degree. And I think what cities like Hamburg to a certain degree show, but also other cities, is there is a lot of immobile capital attached to the industrial structure of cities. And we have, for example, civil aviation industry, we have a lot of production industries. 18% of our workforce is industrial workforce. And naturally, a major strategy for cities is not in general to talk about knowledge, but a growth strategy and a retention strategy for those employment-based strategic sectors in the city. Many countries have lost that to a certain degree, and I want, as a polycentric country, raise that point that it would be, so to say, a disadvantage to lose that out of sight, at least for Germany and other countries which still have that potential. It is linking research, for example, of specific institutions to productive new products to output, for example. And I think in Hamburg, although we have not publicized that strategy very much, we are looking into that, and we are looking now into an industrial structure of the 21st century, building up the horizontal and vertical factory within city limits. I think these are big investment opportunities, these are innovation opportunities, but these are also opportunities to intensify the land use within the city and to use infrastructure far more effectively. So I would not, so to say, generalize the argument that research, education, and so on is simply good. Look at the specifics of the city where the catalysts are, and I think the argument of Greg is completely correct, but you should also look at the institutional structure of each country and the cities yourself. Retention and growth strategy of existing investments are extremely important.
Very clear. Ole?
A short comment on the thing about the capital cities, since I'm the only capital city in the panel here. Excuse me, Amsterdam. But as far as I know, it's another one. I could say that investors are not coming to Stockholm because it's a capital city. They are coming because of investment opportunities. They're coming because of our business, academic institution, the people that live there or whatever, not because we are a capital city. And since 17th century, we haven't had a single prime minister in Sweden who has been in favor of the capital city of Stockholm.
Great.
I know.
Can I ask our advisors and investors panel, what have you think of what you've heard back? Are you more enthused and engaged, more optimistic as a result of what you've heard from the cities than you were? What are your observations?
Certainly, from an investment perspective, I am. I think the collaborative approach, the balanced approach to marketing, managing, promoting cities is excellent. The understanding of investors' long-term aspirations is key, and I think there is a kind of open dialogue that we're now having with city centres that will benefit the city centres going forward.
I think to your point in your original remarks about how we need to learn from the mistakes of the past, of how we erased parts of our history and then had to spend a long time reinventing our cities. I think what I've heard is that the flexibility, the dynamism, the preparedness to think things through and to change is very much embodied in what I think we've heard over here. Anybody else want to say anything? If not, then can I just ask, one sentence each, just specifically in terms of the leadership question. What do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for your city in the next, couple of years, and that you'd like to see reflected in the report that Greg's going to write for us? Can we start in Stockholm and then come back in the reverse order?
Can I add two?
Yeah.
I must say housing in Stockholm, and then I leave it. Housing is the biggest thing. And then next to that is the inclusion of people coming from Middle East now in numbers now in Sweden and Stockholm, to include them in the society. That is the real thing, because otherwise it won't be so nice in Stockholm in the future.
I think Jürgen's the man to talk to on the housing investment scene. But Howard?
Housing as well for me, plus the productivity of our labour market, that has to be driven right up, certainly over the next 5 years.
Jürgen?
I would think a more general integrated growth strategy. We are looking into housing, we are looking into children's education, we are looking into language learning, to integrating new population coming in. That all adds to a very productive potential future labor force.
Great stuff. Xavier?
Well, as I was saying, don't forget the basics, which includes all these: education, health, immigration, housing, but leading cities for, or leaders for city leading.
Okay. And finally, Amsterdam.
Not only invest in housing, but also in infrastructure, as social infrastructure, as well as physical infrastructure.
Great stuff. Greg, a last thought from you before I close?
Well, I think that city leaders have got two tasks. One is the task to create the conditions for growth, and all of these 5 cities are certainly doing that. But the second task is the one they've all referred to, which is dealing with the unintended consequences of growth, the externalities that come with it, the challenges in the labour market, the challenges in housing, the challenges in infrastructure. And the cities that become the global powerhouses are the ones that learn how to deal with the externalities and to turn them into assets and opportunities.
That must be right. And I'm sure we're going to find more lessons on how we all do that in your final report. As we said at the start of this session, this is merely the hors d'oeuvre in terms of the work that Greg and the OECD are doing for an event which will take place June 24th to the 26th this year in Manchester. And if you like what you've heard today, then you're all welcome to come to the OECD Lead Forum, when all of these cities will be invited to a workshop at that event, at which the OECD and people ULI and people from all over the world will be talking about cities' growth development, and we'll be able to see the results of Greg's study. In some senses, this session has, for me, proved a vindication of what it is we wanted to do. In the 2 years ago, we talked about how it was investments that drove growth. It was not promotion; it's the fundamentals. In Xavier's terms, in Barcelona's terms, it's the basics. That must be right. But I think what's come out of this is that leadership, despite my attempts to get us talking about leadership, we've not really talked about leadership in the structures and governance sense. What we've talked about is what leaders do. And that must be the right thing, not least at a conference like this, but I think it's the right thing to do anyway. And in particular, seeing cities in a flexible way working across boundaries. So I think I've learned a lot from today. I hope you have. I'd like to thank Reed Meadem for bringing us into Palais for this event. I'd like to thank the OECD for their continuing support to this partnership, for ULI for the support they provided. But above all, I'd like to thank our speakers, and I hope you'll join me in giving them a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.